Welcome to our channel. Enjoy the video.
For 30 years, a tiny piece of evidence sat in the shadows of a murder investigation. It couldn't speak. It couldn't identify anyone. And for decades, investigators had no idea just how important it would become. But before that clue could change everything, there was a little girl who simply didn't come home. It was a warm August evening in Fort Wayne, Indiana. 8-year-old April Tinsley was a child who should have been thinking about ordinary things. School, friends, and the next day of summer. But on August 31, 1988, something went terribly wrong. April disappeared. Her family waited. Then they started looking. And as the hours passed, concern turned into something much darker. Because April wasn't simply missing. Someone had taken her life. A few days later, investigators discovered April's body in a rural area outside Fort Wayne. The search for answers began immediately. Who had done this? Why April? And most importantly, how could someone commit such a terrible crime and simply disappear? Investigators collected evidence from the scene. But in 1988, forensic technology had limitations that seem almost unbelievable today. DNA testing existed, but the sophisticated genetic genealogy techniques that would eventually transform cold case investigations were decades away. So investigators had evidence. They just didn't yet have a name. The years passed. 1989. 1990. 1991. 1992. The case remained open. But there was another disturbing development. Someone appeared to know details about April's murder. And whoever that person wasn't finished. Investigators would eventually realize that the killer had left behind something far more valuable than a confession. He had left evidence. Something so small that, at first, it seemed almost insignificant. Something that would remain locked inside the case for years. Then decades. And eventually, that tiny clue would become the beginning of the end. But investigators still had no idea who they were looking for. And while April's family waited for justice, the person responsible was living somewhere in the same world as them. For nearly 3 decades, the case would remain unsolved. Then a new message appeared, and investigators realized the killer might have been closer than anyone imagined. The murder of 8-year-old April Tinsley had already become one of Fort Wayne's most haunting unsolved cases. But then something happened that made the investigation even more disturbing. The killer, or someone claiming to be the killer, started communicating. In the years following April's death, investigators encountered messages connected to the case. They weren't normal communications. They were designed to shock. And they suggested something terrifying. Someone knew what had happened to April. The investigation continued, but there was still no clear identity. No face. No confession. No arrest. Only fragments. And somewhere inside those fragments was a clue. Investigators had recovered biological evidence connected to the crime. At the time, that evidence was extraordinarily important. But there was a problem. A DNA profile could potentially tell investigators whether 2 samples came from the same person. What it couldn't necessarily do was tell them exactly who that person was. So the profile sat there, waiting. Years became decades. Technology changed. Police departments changed. But the case remained. Then came a new era of forensic investigation. Genetic genealogy. Instead of asking only, who does this DNA belong to? Investigators could begin asking a different question. Who is this person's family? That difference would change everything. Investigators began examining genetic information from the unidentified suspect. Instead of searching for one name, they searched for connections. Parents. Relatives. Branches of a family tree. One connection could lead to another. And another. Slowly, an enormous genetic puzzle began shrinking. Somewhere inside that puzzle was a man who had lived for decades without being publicly identified as April's killer. Investigators eventually focused their attention on John D. Miller. But a family tree connection wasn't enough. Police needed something far more powerful. They needed his DNA. And so, after 30 years of uncertainty, investigators finally had something they hadn't had since 1988. A direction. The case was no longer a mystery with thousands of possibilities. It was beginning to point toward one man. But there was still one question. Could investigators prove that the man they had found was the same man whose DNA had been sitting inside the case file for nearly 30 years? Because if the answer was yes, April Tinsley's killer had nowhere left to hide. After 3 decades, investigators finally had a suspect. Now they needed the one piece of evidence that could turn suspicion into certainty. For almost 30 years, April Tinsley's murder had remained frozen in time. The killer had a name investigators didn't know. A face they couldn't identify. And a life that continued while April's family waited for answers. But the evidence had never forgotten. Inside the case were pieces of evidence collected decades earlier. To investigators in 1988, they were important. But technology had limits. A DNA profile could tell detectives that biological evidence came from the same person. It couldn't easily tell them who that person was. Then forensic science entered a new era. Investigators began using genetic genealogy to search for relatives connected to an unidentified DNA profile. Instead of searching a database for one exact match, they could search for a family tree. A distant relative could become a starting point. That relative could lead investigators to another branch. And another. Slowly, the possibilities narrowed. And eventually, investigators focused on one man. John D. Miller. But a genealogy lead was not the same thing as proof. Police needed a direct comparison. So investigators obtained DNA connected to Miller. Then they compared it with the biological evidence preserved from April's case. The result was devastating. The DNA pointed back to the same man. After nearly 3 decades, the mystery finally had an identity. But investigators still had to understand something else. How had the killer managed to remain unidentified for so long? And what had he been doing while April's family waited for justice? The answer was buried in the history of the case. April's murder hadn't simply disappeared. It had remained active in the memories of investigators and in the evidence room. The technology had changed. The investigators had changed. But the biological evidence had stayed. Waiting. In 2018, authorities arrested John D. Miller. A case that had begun in 1988 had finally reached a turning point. 30 years of uncertainty had collapsed into one name. But there was still something deeply unsettling about the timing. Because Miller hadn't been discovered by a lucky confession. He hadn't suddenly walked into a police station. He had been found because science had finally become capable of reading the clue that had been waiting all along. And now investigators were about to confront the man they believed had taken April's life. A man who had spent decades believing the past would never catch up with him. But when detectives finally closed in on Miller, they weren't just looking for an arrest. They wanted to know what happened on that August night in 1988. And the answer would reveal just how long a murderer could hide. Until one tiny piece of evidence finally caught up with him. For 30 years, the question had remained the same. Who killed 8-year-old April Tinsley? Now investigators finally had an answer. John D. Miller. But knowing the name was only the beginning. In 2018, investigators moved against Miller. The case that had once seemed impossible to solve had suddenly become a prosecutable crime. The evidence collected decades earlier had survived. And so had the DNA. The technology had finally caught up with the evidence. Miller eventually admitted responsibility for April's murder. After 3 decades of uncertainty, April's family finally had something they had been waiting for since 1988. An answer. But an answer couldn't give them back the little girl they had lost. It couldn't erase 30 years of questions. And it couldn't undo the years in which the killer had remained unidentified. For investigators, however, the case represented something extraordinary. The evidence had survived nearly an entire generation. The investigators who first worked the case couldn't have known exactly how powerful that evidence would become. They simply preserved it. And that decision mattered. Because decades later, modern forensic techniques were able to extract information from evidence that had once seemed incapable of identifying anyone. The case demonstrated something investigators had learned again and again. A cold case isn't necessarily a dead case. Sometimes it's simply waiting for science to catch up. Genetic genealogy didn't magically solve the murder. It gave investigators a path. A path that eventually narrowed an enormous search to a specific individual. Then traditional police work and DNA comparison helped turn that lead into a case. 30 years after April disappeared, the man responsible was finally brought to justice. But perhaps the most haunting part of April Tinsley's story isn't simply that her killer was eventually found. It's that the answer had been sitting inside the investigation for decades. The clue was there. The evidence was there. What was missing was the technology to understand it. April was only 8 years old when her life was taken. For 30 years, her case remained a question. Then, in 2018, it finally became an answer. The killer thought time was on his side. But time had preserved the one thing he couldn't outrun. The evidence. 30 years. One tiny clue. And eventually, the truth.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our next video. See you in the next one.